Tonight, we don't just tell a historical story, we uncover a fear the Vatican never truly buried. A haunting disquiet that still lingers in the candlelit halls and sealed vaults beneath St. Peter's Basilica. It's a fear not of the classic devils or the loud heretical challenges of the modern world, but of something far, far older: Egyptian magic. Long before the carpenter's son walked the shores of Galilee, the soaring sandstone temples of Egypt held secrets about the soul, the architecture of time, and the raw, shaping power of spoken words. They had a name for this force: Heka. It wasn't superstition, a hopeful plea in the dark. It was a kind of spiritual engineering, a precision of sound, symbol, and intent that they believed could, quite literally, shape reality. And in the silence of those immense temples, they had the results to prove it. When the tide of Christianity began to wash over the ancient world, this profound magic didn't simply vanish. It was a force too foundational to disappear. It was absorbed, certainly, rewritten and carefully silenced, yes, but never truly destroyed. It was buried inside forbidden texts, hidden in chants no one was allowed to hear, and locked away in rooms even the highest cardinals could not enter without a special dispensation. This narrative isn't about fantasy or a simple clash of creeds. It is about control. Because if you could speak to the divine, if you could harness creation's power without a priest, you have no need for a church hierarchy. If your individual soul holds this immense shaping power, you cannot be ruled, no matter how golden the scepter or how absolute the doctrine. That is the terrifying core of what they feared. So, before you scroll past and forget, pause and ask yourself, what precisely did they erase? And why, centuries later, are they still so profoundly afraid? Like this video, subscribe, because tonight we open the book they tried to erase, and the words we discover are still very much alive. It was supposed to be locked away forever, a dangerous secret confined to the dark. But history, like the Nile, always finds a way to reveal its treasures. One ordinary afternoon in 1824, a crumbling wooden chest arrived at the Musée du Louvre in Paris. It was misfiled, casually mislabeled, and promptly forgotten in a storage room dedicated to minor antiquities. A historical footnote until a junior archivist, perhaps driven by boredom or pure curiosity, peeled away the decaying linen wrappers. Inside was a papyrus scroll, impossibly old, a piece of written history older than anything in the museum's current public archives. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard funerary scroll, perhaps a portion of the Book of the Dead, a comfort to the deceased. But when the first full lines were finally translated, the quiet museum atmosphere shattered. Everything changed. The papyrus did not speak of the usual gods, or simple burial rites, or pleas for the afterlife. It spoke instead of light, of breath, and of a force that could command the world with sound alone. It read less like a religious text, and more like an advanced manual, a terrifyingly practical spellbook. The translation was only halfway finished when word, a mere whisper at first, reached the ears of power. Within days, the word had traveled the long road to Rome. Quietly, urgently, the Vatican dispatched its own emissaries to the Louvre. These were not bombastic public figures, but silent scholars, men of immense, focused intellect who moved with the invisible authority of the Holy See. Their mission was brutally simple: acquire the scroll, no matter the cost, and ensure its silence. The French scholars who returned a week later, eager to continue their groundbreaking work, found only an empty drawer. There was no record of the papyrus's removal, no explanation for its absence, just a silent, chilling void where a piece of history should have been. It had become a ghost before they even had time to fully name it. But why? Why would the most powerful religious institution on earth care so deeply about an old Egyptian spell? The answer lies in what the papyrus described. It told of priests who could command the winds with a whisper, of magnificent temples, not merely for worship, but for acoustic resonance, built to echo human voices and multiply their spiritual power. It detailed symbols that weren't merely writing, but charged tools. When spoken or inscribed correctly, they could pierce the veil between worlds. This was not mythology, it was instruction. And that truly terrified the Vatican. Because if even a fraction of it was true, then the Egyptians weren't just builders of immense stone tombs. They were keepers of something far older, far more dangerous to a centralized faith. A kind of knowledge that didn't rely on blind faith, but on direct, repeatable experience. You didn't need to believe in a god through a third-party intermediary. You just needed to speak the right words in the right order at the right time. The key to the divine was yours, not the church's. The church could not allow that then, and one could argue they cannot allow it now. That scroll has since become one of the most compelling ghost stories whispered among archivists and forbidden historians. Some believe it's hidden deep beneath the Vatican library, sealed in a lead case and guarded by priests whose sole duty is to ensure its perpetual silence. Others claim copies exist in coded texts, fragments smuggled out by disillusioned monks who couldn't bear to destroy such sublime knowledge. A few fringe scholars even believe that fragments of its potent language were deliberately buried inside early Christian prayers, cloaked in the sanctity of Latin, altered just enough to stay functional, yet completely hidden. What is certain is this: it should not have been found, and once it was, it vanished again with the speed of a curse. But not before leaving behind a trail. Whispered references in old letters, faint sketches in forbidden notebooks, and one curious, unexplainable fact. After the papyrus disappeared, the Vatican quietly updated the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of banned texts, not with a title, but with a simple, anonymous catalog number, one that doesn't exist in any public system, one that points only to an empty shelf in a vast, secret library. So, the question is no longer whether the papyrus was real. The true question is whether the Church still profoundly fears what it might reveal. Because if the ancient Egyptians knew how to speak power into being, if they were the first to codify this sound-based magic, then everything we've been told about prayer, ritual, and the divine changes. Maybe the Vatican wasn't protecting us from a hoax. Maybe they were frantically hiding a fundamental truth we were never supposed to learn how to pronounce. There was a time, a profound era etched in stone and starlight, when people looked up at the night sky and saw gods with the heads of animals. These were not monsters of a nightmare, nor were they the demons of a fearful moralistic future. They were, in the Egyptian mind, symbols of perfect, unyielding power, balance, and mystery, forces of nature personified. Anubis, with the quiet, watchful head of a jackal, was the psychopomp, the patient guardian of the dead, the surveyor of transition, and the master of sacred preparation. His purpose was not to steal souls, but to ensure their safe passage across the threshold. Thoth, majestic with the head of an ibis, watched over wisdom, writing in the measured flow of time. He was the architect of language and the arbiter of disputes. And Sekhmet, the lioness, was the terrifying and magnificent daughter of the sun, capable of bringing both catastrophic destruction and profound burning healing. These entities were not evil in the duality we understand today. They were teachers, protectors, and guides, the living embodiment of the universal clockwork. But that all changed. It had to change. When a new monolithic story began to take hold in the ancient world, its tellers, the evangelists and early bishops of the nascent Christian faith, knew one thing. To succeed, they needed to ensure that absolutely no one looked back at the older, more potent narrative. As Christianity spread, slowly and then with terrifying speed, throughout the vast and chaotic expanse of the Roman Empire, it faced a massive, granite-hewn problem. That problem was Egypt itself. This was a land where religion wasn't a choice or a Sunday observance. It was woven into every wall, every scroll, every heartbeat, every grain of the fertile black earth. Egyptian temples had stood colossal, immovable, and echoing with millennia of reverence for thousands of years before the first gospel was even whispered in the Near East. Their gods, quite simply, were not going away easily. They had too much history, too much power, too much architectural evidence. So the early church made a dark, brilliant decision. If it couldn't erase Egypt, it would systematically twist it. And that is exactly the profound cultural alchemy that took place. Anubis, the quiet, dignified guardian, was suddenly transformed into a symbol of utter darkness. His jackal head, once a sign of reverence and expertise in the journey of the soul, suddenly looked demonic, beastly, and predatory. Set, who represented chaos, necessary transformation, and the potent, untamed violence of the universe, was rewritten entirely as evil itself, the precursor to the modern devil. Even the esteemed Thoth, the very god of knowledge and measured calculation, was reduced to a shadowy, often forgotten figure in old Christian texts, his sacred wisdom now deemed profane. Their colossal statues were broken, their temples were consecrated and converted, and their potent names were quietly but ruthlessly replaced with terrifying new concepts, things like Satan, Lucifer, and the devil. But this was far more than simple name-calling or sectarian rivalry. This was masterful, centuries-spanning strategy. By labeling these deep-rooted, complex gods as demons, the emerging church gave the population a compelling reason to fear them. People were told not to question the source of the magic, not to understand the subtle philosophy behind the lioness or the jackal, but only to fear them, to turn away from them and seek safety in the new faith. And it worked. Within just a few rapid, brutal generations, entire, magnificent mythologies were pushed to the edge of societal memory. Sacred, protective symbols became warning signs against transgression. Powerful, world-shaping words were suddenly left untranslated, their phonetic power muted. The gods were buried beneath a massive new layer of doctrine, but they were not, as the Vatican desperately hoped, forgotten. If you know where to look, you can still catch a glimpse of them, the ghosts of the gods, lurking in plain sight. They are visible in the high, dusty corners of a 1,000-year-old stained glass window, in the strange animal-masked figures carved into the choir stalls of European cathedrals, or even in the hidden corners of the vast mosaic floors of ancient basilicas. The winged figures, the occasional serpent, the ever-present, unblinking eyes. They are not entirely Christian, not by the doctrinal standard. They are echoes of something immeasurably older, powerful, enduring fragments that the Church, for all its might and all its purging, could not completely erase. The deeper question, the one that should keep scholars awake at night, is why they tried so tirelessly in the first place. The core reason was, and remains, control. Egyptian magic, Heka, taught the common person that divine power could be accessed and channeled from within the self, that the individual had the ability to speak to the cosmic without the need for a hierarchical middleman. It taught that death was not a final, terrifying judgment, but a manageable, navigated doorway to continued existence. These concepts, self-empowerment, direct access, and eternal continuity, did not fit the new system, which demanded rigid obedience, confession, and the singular authority of the priest. They made people too spiritually free. And spiritual freedom, when you're building an empire based on singular belief, is the most dangerous kind of revolution. So the gods of nature and wisdom became demons of the dark. Their profound, nuanced stories were rewritten into threats of eternal damnation, and their wisdom, the vast library of spiritual and material knowledge accumulated over 3 millennia, was locked behind towering walls labeled forbidden. They were erased, not because they were false, but because they were in the way. Today, as archaeologists and seekers translate lost texts and reclaim names that were once feared into silence, the truth becomes painfully obvious. These gods were never intrinsically evil. They were simply and dangerously in the way of a new empire's foundation. For centuries, the colossal walls of Egypt's temples and tombs spoke a language no one living could truly understand. A silent, arresting symphony of strange symbols, ibis birds, cobras, eyes, scarabs, suns, and carved human figures in perpetual procession. To the invading Greek, the conquering Roman, and the fearful medieval scholar, these were thought to be beautiful but ultimately meaningless decorations, a kind of primitive, secret code, or perhaps even mere art. But the truth was more immediate and far more dangerous to the emerging order of the West. These symbols were not just pictures, they were words. They were the deep, complex, and potent language of a powerful civilization. And the Church, sensing the danger, wanted them to remain silent forever. Before a single European scholar could reliably translate one full sentence of hieroglyphic text, the Vatican and its intellectual allies had already decided that the Egyptian script was an active existential threat. In the intellectual darkness of the Middle Ages, when the Church was the sole custodian and arbiter of knowledge, Church scholars and traveling monks, the gatekeepers of all learning, declared the Egyptian script the language of sorcerers, or the serpent's tongue. The public and even lower clergy were warned that to study it was not merely heretical, it was to invite a dangerous, soul-corrupting madness. Some believed hieroglyphs literally held dormant, silent spells, that saying them out loud or even correctly tracing them could open doors better left eternally shut. The suppression was systematic, quiet, and complete. Any books in European libraries attempting a serious decode were immediately destroyed or deliberately misfiled. Scholars who showed too much sustained, genuine interest risked immediate excommunication. Libraries that held unusual numbers of fragmented Egyptian texts had a strange tendency to suffer sudden, catastrophic fires. The symbols themselves were treated like the dead language of a long-lost primitive world. But the real, profound reason behind the deep-seated fear wasn't the magic, it was memory. Hieroglyphs were the written record of a version of human history and cosmology that utterly, fundamentally did not match the singular narrative being established in the Bible. The stones told stories of gods who came from the stars, of cycles of time stretching back into an epoch before recorded memory, of civilizations flourishing thousands of years before the Genesis narrative of Adam and Eve. The Church, whose entire authority rested upon a singular, controlled timeline and origin point, simply could not allow those challenging ideas to circulate. If hieroglyphs were ever truly translated, it would be a foundational challenge to everything the West believed, so they made certain no one could even try. For hundreds of years, the knowledge was entombed within its own script, mute and impenetrable, until a young, brilliant Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion refused to listen to the warnings, allowing himself to become consumed by the beautiful, silent code. In 1822, after years spent sleeping next to his fragmented papers, comparing the ancient Greek inscription to the Demotic and hieroglyphic versions on the famous Rosetta Stone, he experienced the flash of insight that resurrected a civilization. He realized in a moment of history-altering clarity that the hieroglyphs weren't crude pictures or simple symbols of ideas. They were a sophisticated, phonetic written language, a system of pure sound and grammar. And once he read them, the silent past began for the first time to speak. And what it said truly shocked everyone. The unlocked texts described not primitive beliefs, but advanced astronomy used to track the movement of the cosmos with baffling accuracy. They detailed precise calendars, rituals of healing and protection older than any Abrahamic tradition, and yes, specific spells for profound healing and what we might call astral or transcendental travel, the ability to project consciousness beyond the physical body. These were not naive, simple people. They were scientists, mystics, timekeepers, and keepers of a history that predated every Western scripture. Suddenly, all the centuries of systematic fear made horrifying sense, because the Church hadn't been wrong to be worried. If the common person could read these walls, they might start asking questions, big, dangerous ones, about where humanity truly comes from, about who holds the genuine key to spiritual truth, and most potently, about what essential knowledge was deliberately erased to make room for a new religion. After Champollion's monumental decipherment, hieroglyphs became history, safe to study, neatly catalogued, and politely placed behind the glass of a museum exhibit. But even now, 2 centuries later, some translations are still mysteriously kept locked away in private collections. Some pristine tombs are sealed off without explanation, and certain sensitive passages from ancient texts are conspicuously missing from the official published records. So perhaps the question is no longer why the Church banned hieroglyphs. Maybe the question is, what profound secret they still, to this day, don't want us to read. Because every single time a wall is translated, a piece of the original, powerful story comes back. And maybe one day, when enough of the symbols are perfectly understood, the full truth will return, not just about Egypt, but about everything. The Egyptians didn't just think words were sounds escaping the mouth, they believed words were alive. That to speak something was an act of creation, an active process that could directly shape the world around you. They held a conviction that the right phrase, said with the right breath at the right time, could heal, destroy, protect, or even, most alarmingly, raise the dead. Words were not just a tool for communication or reporting facts, they were, in their purest sense, magic. And that kind of belief, that individual linguistic power, made the early church extraordinarily nervous. In ancient Egypt, the very line between what we would call a prayer and what we would define as a spell was essentially non-existent. When a priest chanted a divine or sacred name, it was not a tentative wish offered up to a distant deity. It was a command. The names themselves held intrinsic, absolute power. The more deeply secret a name was, the stronger its energetic charge became. They carved these names, of gods, of the deceased, of protective spirits, into tombs and temples, believing the inscription acted as a permanent, functional shield against spiritual harm. A chilling corollary was the belief that if your name was intentionally erased, a deliberate act of cultural and spiritual vandalism, your soul would vanish forever. But if your name was spoken, especially with powerful intent during a ritual, you could achieve a kind of immortality. In a deeply profound way, memory was immortality, and spoken words kept the spirit alive. Now, imagine a religion built on that premise, that the individual possesses the tools for direct, immediate spiritual power, crossing paths with a rising faith that taught salvation came primarily through silence, obedience, and one singular, holy, divinely interpreted book. The collision was inevitable, and it was brutal. The early church asserted that only the Word of God, mediated through Christ and preached by the priests, had any real authoritative power. Everything else, especially the spontaneous, direct, and inherently democratic magical speech used by Egyptian priests, had to be controlled, discredited, and ultimately outlawed. It was too great an access point for the laity, offering too much spiritual freedom. If any common person could simply speak to the divine, accessing power without the need for a hierarchical church structure, what was the point of the religious authority and its immense tax on the soul? So the church labeled it heresy, a radical deviation from the true path. Ancient Egyptian chants were brutally banned. Coptic prayers, which often seamlessly mixed Christian and Egyptian styles, were ruthlessly censored or destroyed altogether. The fundamental idea that words themselves could carry an inherent independent energy was twisted and demonized into something evil: witchcraft, blasphemy, sorcery. Even speaking in certain specific linguistic patterns or employing intense vocalization could get a person accused, punished, or worse. Yet there is a fascinating, dangerous paradox at play. Even while publicly condemning this magic, the Vatican, in its most secret functions, kept meticulous records. They studied ancient Egyptian ritualistic texts behind iron-locked doors. Some historians believe the Church did not destroy this magical verbal magic, but rather adopted parts of it and rebranded them. Latin, a language removed from common discourse, became the new sacred language, mimicking the Egyptian reverence for secret, potent names. Prayers had to be said in specific, exact patterns, not for poetic beauty, but for ritualistic, functional effectiveness. Chanting became a core component of ritual. Silence, the absence of unauthorized heka, became equated with power. And while the church warned the public about the dangers of magical speech, they quietly utilized those same sonic rhythms, that same deep reverence for specific sounds and orders behind the altar in the hidden parts of the Mass. Because deep down, at the highest levels of spiritual knowledge, they knew the Egyptians were right. Words change things. Even today, you can viscerally feel it. The way a perfectly constructed sentence can make your skin tingle with understanding. The way a song lyric, a mere arrangement of sounds, can stick in your head and alter your mood for days. The way a single name, spoken after years of silence, can physically break a heart or bring someone back to life vivid and eternal in your memory. This isn't superstition born of ignorance. It is connection. It is intention. And it is ancient. And that kind of belief, that individual linguistic power, made the early church extraordinarily nervous. There is a spell, or more accurately, a declaration of rising, found deep within the Egyptian Book of the Dead that reads with an unsettling familiarity, like something pulled straight from a church sermon or a powerful passage of a Christian hymn. It speaks of a soul ascending, of a body reawakening from the eternal sleep, and of a cleansing, brilliant light breaking through the utter darkness of the grave. But this profound text wasn't written by Christians. It was meticulously carved into the unyielding stone of tomb walls and transcribed onto delicate papyri over 1,000 years before the first gospel was even whispered aloud. And once scholars started translating it with any breadth and depth, things got intensely, spiritually uncomfortable. The passage, known today as Spell 168 or variations thereof depending on the manuscript, is simple in its stated purpose. It is meant to guide the soul of the dead through the terrifying labyrinth of the underworld and ultimately to bring them back into a glorious conscious state of life in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. But the language of the words is startlingly powerful. They speak of being born again, mes in the Egyptian tongue, a concept of regeneration. They describe crossing a solemn, unavoidable threshold of judgment. They speak of standing naked and truthful before a divine, absolute force that will weigh your heart, the seat of your soul and intention, against the feather of Ma'at, truth, cosmic order. And if you pass this judgment, if your heart is lighter than the feather, you rise. Not just spiritually, in some ethereal afterlife, but with a form of potent, eternal, physical life. Your flesh, they believed, could be made to return, your breath restored, your unique name called, and you would live again, fully conscious in the eternal fields of eternity. Does that sound familiar? To the scholars who first fully translated and publicly discussed these texts in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it felt like a jarring, cosmic déjà vu. The parallels to early Christian resurrection stories, the final judgment, and the concept of an ultimate singular savior figure were too strong and too structurally similar to ignore. But this raised a massive, troubling question that had to be suppressed. How could Egyptian priests have described the resurrection of the dead in such vivid, powerful detail long before Christianity ever emerged from the soil of the Near East? The Church, which had painstakingly cultivated the idea that these concepts were utterly unique to its singular revelation, didn't have a good, doctrinally comfortable answer. So for a long time, the knowledge was avoided. Published translations of the Book of the Dead were selectively limited. Certain sensitive pages were mysteriously left out of early Western editions. Museums were quietly pressured to lock away fragments that referenced rebirth, mess, or eternal life with too much specificity, and the resurrection spell itself became something that was only talked about in hushed academic whispers safely behind the closed doors of universities. But truth, like the Nile flood, eventually spreads. It became undeniable that Egypt had its own ancient, profoundly developed version of a judgment day. It was clear that Osiris, the great god who was murdered, dismembered, and then miraculously rose again to rule the underworld, shared more than a few essential mythic traits with another well-known figure who died and returned. Even the core symbolism of crossing a mystical river, like the river Styx or Jordan, being washed clean of sin and stepping into eternal light, had deep, undeniable roots in ancient Egyptian theology and belief. The revolutionary, unsettling implication was that the foundational idea of resurrection, the hope for a triumph over death, wasn't necessarily born in a single cave or tomb near Jerusalem. It may have been a universal hope, a mythic structural truth that was originally carved into stone along the entire fertile length of the Nile, growing for centuries in the shadows of temple walls and the protected space of sacred scrolls. The church could not outright ban the Book of the Dead. Its existence and immense antiquity were too well known. But it could effectively downplay it, dismiss it as primitive myth and allegory, and pretend that the similarities were merely coincidental or vague metaphor. And for a while, that systematic reframing worked. But now, as we look back, translating with fresh, digitally aided eyes, the haunting power returns. What we are finding is that the Egyptian resurrection spell doesn't clash with Christian belief, it mirrors it. Which leads to the most haunting, compelling thought of all. Maybe the story of dying and returning, of being judged and reborn, was never about one isolated religion achieving a singular revelation. Maybe it is something deeper inside the human consciousness, a profound, structural truth whispered again and again in different tongues across cultures and continents. And maybe Egypt just happened to be the first great civilization to write it down in precise, astonishing detail for all time. Most people think of alchemy as a simple, misguided pursuit. The foolish attempt by old, bearded men in dusty, firelit rooms to turn cheap metal, specifically lead, into precious gold. The popular imagination sees them mixing strange, noxious powders, hoping to suddenly get rich through a failed science. But in ancient Egypt, the birthplace of the art, alchemy was something immeasurably deeper, more complex, and vastly more dangerous to religious authority. It was not primarily about gold in the material sense, it was about the soul. Egyptian priests and mystics believed that everything in the universe, from a star to a stone, from a river to a human, had multiple interconnected layers: the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. To truly change one layer, you had to understand and manipulate all three simultaneously. So when they spoke about transforming base lead into pure, incorruptible gold, they were often not speaking of metal at all. They were talking about the human condition, about turning the heavy, dull, ignorant parts of a person into something pure, bright, eternal, and truly aware. It was a kind of inner science of spiritual refinement. The complex symbols of alchemy, the coiled serpent, the solar disk, the rising lotus, the merging of opposite elements, were not just tools in a chemistry lab, they represented the stages of internal transformation. Lead was the nigredo, the beginning, the state of darkness, confusion, and ignorance, the heavy, unrefined self. Gold was the urubedo, the end, the ultimate state of light, full awareness, and spiritual enlightenment. In their most sacred rituals, Egyptian mystics used colors, rhythmic chants, and even specific potent incenses to mimic these alchemical stages, inducing a process of transformation inside the body and mind. The goal was not temporal wealth, it was rebirth into higher consciousness. And this is what made the practice so fundamentally uncomfortable for the emerging church. It offered a path to the divine, a process of salvation that bypassed the entire ecclesiastical structure. You didn't need to be baptized, go to confession, or take sacraments administered by a priest. You simply needed to look inward, to refine yourself, to metaphorically burn away what was false and become, through a kind of interior self-mastery, something new and illuminated. That kind of direct, unmediated power, spiritual self-sovereignty, was deemed utterly dangerous. So the Church, over centuries, meticulously and systematically labeled alchemy as pagan, then as heretical, and finally simply as a forbidden art, the domain of charlatans. But as with all truly profound Egyptian knowledge, it was not forgotten. Behind closed doors and in the secretive corners of monasteries and university cells, Christian mystics quietly studied old Egyptian texts and Arabic commentaries. They borrowed heavily from the alchemical process. The foundational idea of purifying the soul, of willingly going through the metaphorical fire of suffering to reach a state of grace or heaven, shows up again and again in later Christian writings. But the critical connection to its Egyptian scientific roots was deliberately and methodically erased. In the public eye, alchemy became a joke, a failed, greedy science, a childish fairy tale. But that is not how it began. In fact, the very word alchemy itself comes from the Egyptian term kemet, or chemi, which means black earth, the rich, fertile soil of the Nile Delta, the place where life, magic, and knowledge begins. When the knowledge was passed to the Greeks and then through the Islamic world, where they added the Arabic article al, the profound original meaning was almost completely lost. Yet the secrets were still there, hidden in symbolic codes. Some contemporary esoteric historians believe the final goal of Egyptian alchemy was not just to change the soul's disposition, but to activate something dormant within the body itself, a spark, an unseen energy channel that could awaken higher senses, visions beyond the ordinary, a focused energy capable of subtly bending the perception of reality. And if that sounds like magic, perhaps that is precisely the point. Maybe the greatest, most enduring treasure Egypt offered the world wasn't gold, but a process, a map of consciousness, a way back to the inherent divinity within the self. The church wasn't afraid they'd succeed in getting rich. They were terrified they'd succeed in waking up. Imagine standing in the close, profound silence of a candle-lit Egyptian tomb, surrounded by high walls completely covered in intricate, ancient symbols. A priest, a figure of deep spiritual authority, leans over the mummy of someone once powerfully revered, a pharaoh, a queen, or a high official. In his hand is a ritualistic tool, sometimes a specialized adze carved from iron, or a sacred protective stone known as the scepter. He raises it gently and touches it precisely to the lips of the deceased. This act is not one of mourning, not a final goodbye, but a deliberate, focused attempt to awaken. This was the core moment of the opening of the mouth ritual, Pet Row, one of the most sacred, complex, and potent rites in ancient Egypt, and consequently, one of the most feared and violently suppressed by the church. The Egyptians held a complex, sophisticated belief about death. It was not seen as a final, catastrophic end, but rather as a passage, a necessary, lengthy journey through the duat, the underworld. But to successfully navigate this passage, the soul, Ba and Ka, needed its faculties, its senses, restored to full operational capacity. It needed its eyes to see the dangers and the pathways, its ears to hear the commands of the gods, and most crucially, its mouth to speak. Without speech, the soul would be lost, condemned to a second death. It could not declare its innocence before the divine judges. It could not say its own protective name, and it could not call out to the gods for guidance or aid. So, the priests performed this powerful, literal rite. They worked to restore the voice of the dead. This wasn't merely a metaphor for remembrance. They genuinely believed that the focused ritual, when performed with perfect precision, could literally work, allowing the deceased to interact with the spiritual world. The ritual itself was an exhausting, protracted event involving specific chants, the burning of potent incense, the use of special ritual instruments, and the recitation of sacred, charged texts. The deceased's body was treated with the reverence one might show a sleeping god. The mouth was symbolically and physically opened with precision. And the final words spoken during the rite were not just prayers or laments, they were commands. Rise, speak, remember, live. To the ancient Egyptians, this was the highest act of spiritual compassion, love, and powerful Heka. But when this ritual was described and imperfectly understood by early Christian scholars, it was viewed as something else entirely: necromancy. The idea of restoring speech and power after death was an anathema. Speaking with the dead was a monstrous sin in the eyes of the Church. Only the singular, absolute God was supposed to hold sovereign power over life and death, over the soul's ultimate destination. And here was a sophisticated ritual, thousands of years old, that seemed to claim the ability to do just that, to interfere with the divine decree. The Church's reaction was panic, followed by systematic elimination. They called the rite satanic. They declared that the priests were not restoring life, but were summoning demons. That the ritual was not a passage, but a dangerous, gaping doorway to the underworld, and that it was absolute proof the Egyptians were followers of false gods. The Vatican banned all full translations of the ritual. Any European scholar caught studying the texts associated with it risked immediate exile or worse. In public sermons, the opening of the mouth was held up as the quintessential example of pagan darkness and corruption. But was the theological offense the true reason? Or was it, as always, something much deeper and more pragmatic? If the Egyptians could restore a voice, even if only symbolically, it meant they possessed a profound, ancient knowledge about the structure of life, the nature of memory, and the mechanics of the soul's transition. And that knowledge, critically, did not descend from Christian doctrine. It came from somewhere older, somewhere the Church could not possibly control or claim ownership of it. That's what made it truly dangerous. Not because it was evil, but because it appeared to be effective and autonomous. Today we understand the opening of the mouth as part of a larger, incredibly complex spiritual science, a way of aiding the Ba to rejoin the Ka and move on successfully. A vital mechanism for keeping the past and the identity of the person alive through the spoken word. And perhaps that is precisely what the Church feared most, a truth that remains terrifying to any centralized power. The voice is power. And if the dead could speak, maybe they would tell stories no one in power wanted to hear. Stories about what came before the Bible, before Rome, before the necessary silence became sacred. To the Vatican, that voice was the most profound, enduring threat. Long before Latin hymns echoed beneath the soaring arches of cathedrals, before the cross stood triumphantly over the ruins of pagan temples, there was an imposing, intellectual figure with the head of an ibis and the profound knowledge of the gods. His name was Thoth, or Jehuti. To the ancient Egyptians, Thoth wasn't merely another deity. He was the very mind behind magic, or Heka, the relentless keeper of all recorded time, and the divine writer of every spell, law, and cosmic measure. And his followers, the elite priests of Thoth, were entrusted with something the common populace, and certainly the later monotheistic religions, were never meant to see: the raw language of creation itself. These were not ordinary public-facing priests. They weren't primarily concerned with leading mass ceremonies or blessing mundane crops. They were the original scribes, scientists, and mystics, the intellectual aristocracy of Egypt. They worked in secret, labyrinthine chambers within the temple complexes, perpetually surrounded by vast, fragile scrolls and an overwhelming density of symbols. Their singular, sacred duty was to meticulously record, protect, and pass on divine knowledge. They believed with absolute certainty that the correct arrangement of words could literally shape reality, that writing something down in the right sequence could momentarily bend the laws of nature. And for millennia, they passed that knowledge, layered in complex codes, philosophical poetry, and specific rhythmic chants, from one carefully chosen initiate to the next. But then came the inevitable, relentless advance of a new religion, one that aggressively disliked competition and demanded singular allegiance. As Christianity began its dramatic rise across the collapsing infrastructure of the Roman world, the Church initiated a calculated and systematic purge of anything that hinted at rival individualistic powers. And the immense libraries containing the spells and wisdom of Thoth were full of them. These texts contain detailed incantations to call back the vital energy of the dead, complex, ancient star maps that claim to predict events centuries in advance, and elaborate rituals that promise to unlock profound visions and awaken hidden, dormant parts of the human mind. To the centralizing church authority, this was all unambiguous sorcery, dangerous heresy, and an immediate threat to the authority of one single, divinely revealed book. So the purge began in earnest. Scrolls were burned publicly and privately. Temples dedicated to Thoth were destroyed or ritually cleansed. The very names of Thoth's priests were systematically scratched off of tomb walls and papyri, an act of profound spiritual annihilation. They labeled them, one and all, servants of darkness. Some of the most zealous early Christian writers even claimed that Thoth himself was not a god at all, but a cunning, shape-shifting demon in disguise, leading humanity away from the true light. Yet not everything was successfully consumed by the fire. Some of the wisest priests, foreseeing the coming darkness, were proactive. They meticulously disguised their profound teachings in the form of Greek philosophical treatises. They buried critical texts in sealed jars deep within desert caves. They passed the most dangerous secrets along in the form of whispered, complex riddles and coded poetry. Fragments of their wisdom, often without attribution, slipped into the writings of later Hermetic philosophers and early Islamic mystics. Some scholars even assert that the very principles used by medieval alchemists were in fact fragmented, repurposed pieces of Thoth's teachings, utilized without any memory of their original source. His presence never fully disappeared, it simply went underground. And the Vatican, crucially, knew this. In the deepest, most secret libraries beneath Rome, locked behind immense iron doors, exist documents that still mention Thoth by his original name. There are spells written in ancient Coptic, a later form of Egyptian, that mix concepts of Heka and early Christian piety. There are archaic star charts that do not align with any modern astronomical system. There are pages so incredibly old and delicate they might literally crumble if touched by uninitiated hands. The church didn't destroy absolutely everything. Some things they kept, perhaps to study and understand their enemy, perhaps to ensure that no one else could access them, but definitely not to share with the world. Because here is the truth, the profound, unsaid reason for the intense suppression. The priests of Thoth believed and taught that knowledge was divine, that learning was the highest form of worship, and that curiosity could lead you directly and independently closer to the gods. And the church feared that idea above all others. Because if people could truly discover spiritual truth on their own, guided only by their own intellect and the ancient scripts, then what, absolutely, would they need priests and a hierarchical church for? The priests of Thoth were therefore erased from history, not because they were wrong, but because they remembered too much and taught too freely. Look up at the immense canvas of the night sky. To our modern, scientific eyes, it's just stars, distant thermonuclear suns, seemingly random pinpricks of light scattered across the dark vacuum. But to the ancient Egyptians, the sky was infinitely more. It was a map, a living code, a spiritual mechanism. They didn't just passively look at the stars, they actively listened to them. They believed the cosmos spoke in predictable, powerful patterns, and that by aligning with these patterns, they could access the Heka, magic, of the universe. One of the oldest, most pervasive, and most powerful symbols in that cosmic language was the serpent. In the innermost sanctuary of Egyptian temples, you will find images of great snakes carved into the ceilings, perpetually slithering through the sky alongside specific constellations, planets, and moons. These were not mere artistic decorations or simple mythological beasts. They were instructions. The serpent represented primordial energy, cyclical flow, transformation, and the ability to move fluidly between worlds, between life and death, earth and sky, the physical and the spiritual. And when that potent symbol was combined with the specific, measured timing of certain stars, the serpent became a functional, working tool of power. Egyptian priests, masters of sacred astronomy, used this knowledge extensively in their magical rites. They aligned every critical ritual, from healings to temple foundings, with specific auspicious constellations. They whispered the names of stars during complex healing spells. They went to the extraordinary effort to build entire temples to mirror the heavens above them. Some chambers were engineered with such precision that during one singular moment of the year, a specific solstice or equinox, a perfect beam of starlight would fall aslit and penetrate to precisely illuminate a statue, an altar, or the head of a sleeping pharaoh. That moment was not merely symbolic. It was deemed a massive infusion of cosmic power. The sky was literally charging the ritual, the temple, and the people within. The early church, obsessed with establishing a God who was outside the physical world and who acted solely through divine fiat, despised this idea utterly. Early Christian doctrine taught that God was separate from the messy complexity of the stars, that worshiping the heavens or attempting to manipulate celestial patterns was pure paganism, dangerous and blasphemous. Any Egyptian text that discussed astrology, cosmic timing, or the symbolism of the serpent was immediately labeled for the flames or permanent concealment. Star maps were declared heretical, and the profound, transformative serpent magic was forcefully renamed serpent worship and twisted into an image of pure evil, the demonic temptation in the Garden of Eden. But the truth is, the Egyptian serpent and star rituals weren't about bowing to planets or worshiping snakes. They were about tuning in. The priests believed the universe was a living being, that everything moved with purpose, and that by understanding and harmonizing with those patterns, a human could align themselves with something unimaginably bigger. They could heal faster, think clearer, and even unlock hidden spiritual capacities within the soul. And that core idea, that human beings could access divine, self-activating power without official permission, was existentially terrifying to a church built entirely upon centralized control. So the Vatican worked tirelessly to erase it. Yet fragments of this cosmic architecture survived, subtly hidden even within the earliest Christian symbols. The serpent figure occasionally depicted on the cross, a reference to Moses, and the brazen serpent, an older healing symbol. The circle of 12 stars, often seen around the head of the Virgin Mary, and even the timing of major holidays like Christmas, which were strategically aligned with ancient solstice patterns, all show undeniable traces of old star rites, cleverly cloaked in new imagery. Today, astronomers and Egyptologists are still discovering that ancient Egyptian astronomy was incredibly advanced. They tracked the star Sirius, Sopdet, with an accuracy that continues to baffle modern researchers. They built entire calendars based on solar and star cycles. But what they didn't write down, what they could only pass from priest to priest through intense ritual, was the feeling. What they saw during those moments of perfect celestial alignment, and what latent power they awakened within themselves. Maybe some of it was symbolic. Maybe some of it was real, verifiable power. But one thing is certain. The Egyptians weren't just passively watching the stars. They were speaking with them. And the Vatican, sitting under its own dome of painted celestial imagery, is still not ready to admit how much those cosmic voices once told humanity. Open a Bible, the foundational text of Western civilization, and read the most famous stories. A baby hero hidden by his mother in a rush basket and floated down a river. A divine God who dies a brutal death and miraculously returns to life. Plagues that turn rivers to blood and blanket the land in impenetrable darkness. These narratives are things we reflexively categorize as purely, uniquely biblical revelations. Yet if you embark on the difficult intellectual journey back far enough, past the authoritative Latin, past the source Greek, past even the earliest canonical Hebrew, you will find something profound, unsettling, and undeniable. You will find the echoes of Egypt. Long before the foundational books of the Bible were committed to parchment, Egyptian myths had been told, acted out, and meticulously recorded for thousands of years. These were not simple campfire tales. They were stories about gods who physically walked the earth, about miraculous divine births, about cosmic floods that reset time, and, most importantly, about magic words that possessed the power to shape the very fabric of the world. To the Egyptians, these were not charming fairy tales. They were sacred memory, history, and spiritual instruction. And for millennia, These narratives were preserved on delicate papyrus scrolls and inscribed into every surface of their monumental architecture. Then, a quiet, insidious process began. As early Christianity spread, it acted as a cultural sponge, absorbing, adapting, and repurposing parts of the older, enduring traditions it encountered. Some Egyptian concepts were adapted seamlessly. Some were renamed with Greek or Roman titles, and some were rewritten so completely that you would never recognize their potent Egyptian roots unless you knew exactly what structural fingerprints to look for. But the evidence remains clear and structural. Take the ancient story of Horus. He is miraculously conceived from the goddess Isis after she meticulously gathers and reconstructs the scattered body of her murdered husband Osiris. Horus is a child of miraculous, semi-divine birth, protected by powerful forces in the marshes, who grows up to battle the darkness, Set, and restore Ma'at, cosmic order. That story structure existed and was venerated over 1,000 years before the Gospels were written. The pattern, the virgin divine birth, the hidden childhood, the battle with darkness, the ultimate restoration, feels hauntingly, structurally familiar. Or look at the saga of Moses. He is rescued from the Nile in a basket, raised within the royal household of his ancestral enemies, Egyptians, speaks to the mighty Pharaoh, holds a staff that transforms into a serpent, a direct nod to Egyptian serpent power, and possesses the ability to part waters and inflict plagues of cosmic darkness upon the land. These are not just convenient narrative choices. They are structural fingerprints, echoes of powerful Egyptian magic, myth, and ritual, reshaped for a new monotheistic audience. This was not casual borrowing. It was a deliberate, fundamental transformation. Egyptian ideas were not copied thoughtlessly. They were folded like steel into iron, into the structure of a new religion, becoming an unacknowledged foundation. And as the Bible ascended in power and influence, the original parallel myths had to disappear, quietly, carefully, and thoroughly, so that no one would ever be tempted to compare the two texts side by side. The Church did not want people comparing the Ten Commandments to the much older, detailed negative confessions of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the 42 Declarations of Innocence, which similarly codified moral behavior. It did not want scholars pointing out that the concept of a final existential judgment had already been described in chilling detail in the Egyptian Hall of Ma'at, where the heart of the dead was weighed against a feather, a test of moral truth, not just belief. So Egypt was systematically painted as a land of exotic idols, dangerous false gods, and spiritual lost souls. Its immense library of scrolls was labeled as heresy. Its ancient stories were transformed into mere warnings of pagan darkness. And yet the roots remain. Even today, when you look closely at certain uplifting parables, the rhythm of a powerful older language subtly exists beneath the Latin, a language shaped by the wisdom of Nile priests and the profound silence of sun temples, a language that once declared the soul to be truly eternal and the universe itself to be a complex, living mechanism. The Bible did not spring from nowhere. It came through time, through people, and through the echoes of scrolls that were once held in powerful Egyptian hands. While the Church succeeded in creating a new narrative, it never fully succeeded in burying the deep cosmic truth that humanity's greatest spiritual ideas are always shared, recycled, and reborn.